to a special edition of my Twitch stream. Today what I'm going to be doing is giving a lecture on how I build one-shot games. Especially considering what's going on right now in the world. Lots of folks are stuck at home, and I figured it might be fun to kind of talk about how you can quickly pull together a fun, satisfying, one-shot, kind of one-night game experience. Of course, a lot of what I'm going to talk about here today is going to be applicable to, well, a lot bigger games, campaigns even. But I'm going to focus on the tips and tricks that I use to kind of make the best, fun, one-shot games that I can. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the lecture. It's a three-part lecture talking about the three kind of stages of how I build games. That doesn't involve running it. That's like stage 4. And then after this, I'm going to open it up to some Q&A for folks in the chat. And I see that there are a bunch of folks in chat already. Welcome, everybody. That was not shamrocks. Those were tombstones. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start out here with what I like to call step 1. And step 1 is really just kind of the basics. This is kind of like when you sit down and decide, you know what, I'm going to run a game. I need to figure out kind of the basics of what this is even going to be about. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, who are you designing the game for? Who are your players? How many are there? What do they like to play? This isn't, because you're running a one-shot, something that's going to take place in one night, you're not probably going to have a session 0. So you're not going to sit around and build characters in advance. You may tell everybody, hey, throw together a simple first-level character, a simple fifth-level character, whatever you want. But you're not going to spend a great deal of time building a kind of intricate backstory involving everyone's characters. This is a one-shot. No one's going to come to this with a character bible about what they're going to be playing. At best, you might be able to get them to give you a few hooks or something to play with, but that's kind of it. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is who am I building this for? Now, many of us are in quarantine, so or isolation. So you may not have a large group of players. Then again, you might be looking to run a one-shot online, so you could have as many players as you want. Really, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here today is applicable no matter what your group size. You have to do things differently if you're just running a one-shot with one player, but that really comes down to encounter building. Most of the rest of it is pretty much the same. So, I mentioned before that you don't have a session 0. That's not generally part of a one-shot. I mean, you don't really have time to let's sit down and workshop out all of our characters and talk about, what we want to see in the game when you're just kind of running a one-shot. That doesn't mean you still shouldn't take the needs and the disposition of your players into mind when creating your story. It's best for these sorts of games to just kind of stick to middle road fantasy tropes. Monsters that need slaying, treasure that needs finding, things like that. A one-shot is rarely the kind of place to explore deep nuance, especially when you're throwing it together really quickly. It's real easy to make kind of mistakes that way and end up with something that you don't want to necessarily have in a one-shot. Now, also, if you don't have a session 0, it's kind of hard to build player agency, player narrative into the story. This is something that I love to do in my longer games. I like to sit down and talk with the players about what they see for their character, what they want to accomplish with their character, and that is really hard to do when you don't know what the characters are necessarily until the game actually starts. But there are tricks that you can kind of use to get there. Now, of course, you can just write a story with no real hook into the character's backstory at all. It's just an adventure. They are adventurers. They are going to go on it. What agency or what parts of their story they bring to it is kind of left to them. I'd like to be a little bit more proactive about that, and I think there's a couple different ways you can do that. You can ask all of the players to have a similar hook built into their characters. Maybe they all know a certain NPC. Maybe they all went to the same school. Maybe they're all from the same family. That's kind of a unifying hook that you'll be able to play with from everyone's perspective. Alternatively, you could come up with a short list of very simple background pieces that each character can work with. They pick one off the list, and it's something that you know you can play with. I like to do the kind of very simple thing of like, there is a place or a person in town, I need you all to be associated with it, but I want you to tell me how that association works. So if it is a mentor in town, is he your mentor? Is he the rival of your mentor? Is he someone that you scorned long ago? How does your character relate to this mentor? If it's a place, it's a tavern. Is this the tavern that you always like to hang out with? Maybe you work at it. Maybe you run a rival business across the street. Just give me some relation to a place, a person, or a thing. And then when I'm building my story, I can use that. I can know that that exists to help build that into the story that we're about to play. Now, the next thing you have to ask yourself when you're figuring out the basics of an adventure is the next kind of series of questions are all kind of figuring out what the adventure is going to be about. So the first one is usually who is the villain, who's the major threat. If I'm just going to pick a type of monster and run with it, what is that? I'll tell you right now, I'm working on a one-shot for my Eventide setting, and it's a one-shot in which the villains are kobolds. That's it. That's my answer. The villains are kobolds. There is a small tribe of kobolds on the edge of the mud fens, and they are the villain of this adventure. The next question you want to ask yourself is what? What is the villain up to? What is happening that makes this adventure happen right now? You generally don't have to ask when, because when is usually now. It's a one-shot. You don't write it to happen sometime in the future. But what are the villains doing that causes this adventure to take place? So in the one-shot I'm writing, they're raiding a nearby farming community. They have stretched out from the mud fence and have started raiding a nearby farming community. Why are they doing this? We don't know. That's not necessarily something I even need to know just yet. But now I have the who, kobolds, and the what. They are raiding a nearby village. Next, let's ask the most important question is why? Why do the players care? What's their motivation? Is it something personal? Is it just an act of compassion? Is it a promise of loot and treasure? All of those are good answers, but the thing you need to do when you're planning a one-shot is just decide what that motivation is going to be. Now, as I mentioned before, this is where you might also play in with a pre-made character hook, right? If they all know a place, or they're all related to a place, and that place is under threat by the villain, now you have the player motivation. So you've kind of already built it in. In my kobold story, they're raiding this nearby farm. The player's motivation is one of the farmers goes to the nearby larger city where the players live and is wandering around town begging for help, being turned away again and again and again until the players encounter this poor, desperate farmer. He offers them a reward. It's not much, but it's all the farm can spare. He's desperate, asking for someone to help him and his farm. Adventurers don't do it for the loot. Yeah, they do. You just haven't offered enough loot. So we've got the who, we've got the what, we've got the why. The next question you want to ask yourself is the where. When it comes to where, you're trying to figure out where does the adventure take place. This doesn't have to relate to where the villains are doing things or where the PCs even start. What you're trying to do is set up where is the actual adventure itself going to take place. You're running a one-shot. This isn't necessarily the place to run 4 different entirely dramatically disparate scenes. You generally want to pick one and run with it. Build it out, fully flesh it out, make it a full, fun experience. All of these pieces come together to kind of say, you're basically trying to figure out the highlights. If you were then to describe the adventure with as few sentences as possible, you could now do so, because you know who the villains are, you know what they're up to, you know what the PCs have to do to stop them, why they're trying to stop them, and where they have to go to stop them. So you've already kind of got the nucleus of your game. So let's go back to my kobold story. These kobolds are emerging from the mud fens. They are rampaging through a nearby farm. They started by stealing livestock, but now they've stolen the farmer's son. The farmer is desperate. He goes to town looking for the heroes. Now we have our hook. If the heroes agree, now we have an adventure. They travel with the farmer back to his farmstead, leave the farmstead behind, and head to the mud fens to find the missing child. I now have my where as well. The where is the mud fens. It's a giant swamp, a muddy swamp, where these kobolds live in giant mud huts, or mud kind of caves. So I've got an iconic location now, because I have like a mud swamp. I have interesting, fun villains. I have kobolds who love to set traps. I know a lot about them. And I've got the basics for an adventure. Now what I'm trying to do is create kind of this iconic ideal of the adventure, so that when you look back on this one shot, it's very memorable. I'm trying to create, what you want to do is you want to try and create a story that, even though it's short, even though it's not part of an ongoing campaign, it is something that's going to stick with the players, because you've strengthened its concept. That's the trick about doing a one-shot the right way. It's about building a thing that is so kind of platonic that it resonates without a lot of setup, without a lot of building. It's something that they're going to easily be able to latch onto and play with. Nuance is not really your best friend when writing a one-shot. It seems like it's a great idea. Yeah, I'm gonna build this real subtle story, or like a subtle mystery for the evening. Those are really hard to pull off in a one-shot. It's easier to kind of focus on quick, fun adventure, and a plot line that's going to be easy for everyone to grasp. Someone mentioned the 5 W's. It's, like I said earlier, it's almost the 5 W's. The one that you rarely have to care about is the when. When? Now. It's always now. We're doing a one-shot. It's not happening, I'm not doing an adventure that's a setup adventure. It's happening now. So that's step one. Let's recap that a little bit here. So step one is the basics. Who are you designing this for? How do you build in some player story? Who is the villain? What is the villain up to? Why do the players care? Where does the adventure take place? And remember, keep it simple, keep it kind of iconic. So that's kind of my first step, and I'll be honest, it can be a little tricky to come up with some of these pieces. This might be the thing that takes you the longest to get right, but it also requires the least amount of work and fidgeting, right? You just kind of sit down and flip through your monster book and come up with ideas. Think about locations. Think about cool places to have an adventure. You can start from any one of these to be the kind of seed of where your adventure begins. So, you might be like, oh, I really want to use, Minotaurs as my villain because they're awesome. I really want to do a story about a race to the top of a nearby mountain that is hampered by a bunch of Yeti, right? I really want to do an adventure that takes place in a giant graveyard, right? When I say keep it simple, the key to making all of these things work is to just get to the thing that is your mission statement and roll with it. You can do things where it's like, oh, they have an encounter on the road, and then they make it to the place I want them to go, and then there's an encounter outside, and they make their way inside. You're not going to have time to do all that in a one-shot. But, maybe you're running a big one-shot. It's an 8-hour one-shot. Maybe then you have time to add those sorts of things. But I'll talk about that a bit more in the next part of our discussion, which is planning. So you know the basics. You know what your adventure is going to be in a nutshell. You know the villain, what the villain's been up to, why the players are going there, where it's taken place, but you still don't really have the adventure itself built. So, the first thing you want to do when you're planning out an adventure like this is start by imagining the scenes that you want to have happen. These are kind of the set pieces of your adventure. Don't worry right now about how you get from one scene to the other. Don't worry about how it starts. Don't worry about how it ends. Just start imagining what cool, evocative moments you want to create in your adventure. What you're doing is building scenes. You're structuring everything around kind of a moment. These moments should be something that when people think back to the adventure, these are the moments they imagine. Or at least in your mind's eye, that's the moment they imagine. Of course, what they actually remember is really going to be down to them. But you want to set the stage in such a way that these scenes are kind of primed to happen. So let me talk about my kobold adventure. I have two scenes that really immediately come to mind. The first one is a fight in the swamp as they're making their way into this dungeon against giant mud-covered toads. I just think that's evocative. I like the concept of it. It's a big giant frog covered in mud. Maybe they even spit mud balls at you instead of their tongues. And you have to kind of trudge through the swamp, and they're kind of hard to get to. But they're big giant mud toads. That's a scene I want to have happen in this. How do we get there? What happens after? I don't care right now. What I'm doing is building scenes. Now let me think about another scene that I want, and maybe this is the climactic final scene against the kobolds who have stolen this kid. It is in a room where the players are like waist deep in mud, but the kobolds have stilts that they are using to move around the mud more easily than the players, and kind of harassing them with their flanking and being able to be more mobile than the PCs in their den because they set it up. So those are the two scenes that I have in my head. A fight against frogs and a fight against kobolds. Now this is a one-night adventure, so there's probably not going to be an awful lot more than that. There may be another fight, there may be some role-playing encounters, there may be other stuff like that, but I just want to start with those key scenes. And these are usually going to be fights, but they're not always. Sometimes it might be a dramatic scene, sometimes it might be a moment of role-playing that you really want to get to. You're just trying to create the narrative moments that you are envisioning for this story. Now the next thing you want to do is, once you've got these scenes, you want to use those scenes and begin to build a diagram of your story. So this is when you actually start setting them down and start figuring out, okay, how do I get from one spot to the other? How does the story grow from one kind of where it starts, where the PCs just are heading to their place of adventure, to the end where they get to the scenes that I want them to see. That is kind of how you start building narrative bridge structure. Don't worry right now that it might seem like a linear line. You might be going, oh no, I'm building a railroad. That's not what we're talking about here. This isn't the map. This is a diagram of how the story itself goes. And this doesn't have to be anything fancy. This could literally just be a word or two here and there. So let's talk about the kobold adventure as an example. I know I want this fight with toads. I know I want this fight with kobolds. So I have my intro, which is when they meet the poor farmer. I have the role-playing bit of them going to the swamp, and then I'm in the adventure. And I can have the lead-in be the fight with the toads. That's how I can open it. Starting out with a big iconic fight, not a bad idea. So maybe that's how it starts. They get to this den, they follow the trails. The trail leads down into the kobold warren, and inside, just outside, are these toads. Guard toads. Now they're guard toads. Great. Okay, what's my next stage of this? Well, now that I'm down in here, I need to exemplify what kobolds are all about. So I write the word traps and guards. So this isn't my iconic scene at the end. This is probably standard kind of kobold trap hijinks. Why? Because I want to set up that kobolds are the bad guys, because the PCs probably don't know that at this point. or if they do, they still haven't encountered one yet. So I want to give them a chance to fight some kobolds that they can steamroll. So this is probably more of an easy fight. But I'm also looking for a way to build kind of some fun interstitial action here. So maybe that. I write down traps, kobolds. I also start thinking about, okay, how can I kind of up the ante here? Maybe there's a way that they can speak with some other prisoners that the kobolds have and learn about what might happen, right? So I put down role-playing encounter with prisoners. Maybe not the prisoner they're looking for yet, but prisoners nonetheless. And then I'm doing a diagram that leads to the end. So I go end fight, mud room, stilted kobolds, rescue the kid. Okay, I've got a diagram of the story now. And at this point in time, this is going to be the first point in time where you actually really start considering how much time you have to play. Because this is a trick when running a one-shot. You have to kind of start guessing how the time that you have is going to affect what kind of encounters, what scenes you can put into it. I generally like to think that for every hour of play, I get roughly one important encounter. If they're lighter encounters, if it's just traps or a light role-playing thing, maybe it's more like half an hour each, but that's a good benchmark to work with. So if you have 4 hours to play, you can kind of count on 4 encounters. Now maybe if you have some role-playing, some setup, some outro, you want to consider that like an hour block as well. It might take half an hour to get into the action, it might take half hour to get out of the action at the end. Maybe not, maybe the end is a lot more clean. But this is the point where you're starting to build that diagram of the story, where you start to realize, okay, this is what I have time for. Now the next thing you want to do is think about whether or not you want a twist in the story. You've kind of thought about what your plot is, but you do want to spend some time to stop and think about whether or not your story needs some sort of twist, that the narrative changes halfway through. Maybe, halfway through you learn that this kid wasn't kidnapped at all. The farmer thought his child was kidnapped, but he wasn't kidnapped at all. He made friends with the kobolds and is now working with them. That could be an interesting twist. I'm not sure it's a twist I would go with, but you could do that. Any type of story can have this sort of twist where what your motivation appeared to be is not necessarily true. Maybe the villain that you thought was behind all of this is actually working for something else. That's a type of twist. It's a relatively straightforward one, but can be worth thinking about. If you are going to add some sort of twist to your story, this is the point in time where you're still in diagram, where you want to start mapping out how that's going to work and where it needs to occur. This is also the point in time where you want to start thinking about how to foreshadow the twist. A twist that comes out of the blue can be very satisfying, but it can also be a moment where the players just kind of go, huh? Whereas if you give them a clue, even if it's a little one, it can make the whole thing make a lot more sense. So you're going to want to think about a twist. Next, you've got your kind of flow diagram of the story. You've mapped it out. You don't necessarily know what all the encounters are yet, but you've got a good idea of kind of where the combats are going to be versus where the slower parts are going to be, where there's role-playing and talking and investigating and exploring. And yeah, you could make a twist where the farmer ends up being the bad guy. Yeah, where he doesn't even have a kid, and you were sent out there because the kobolds need sacrifices, right? I mean, that could be the twist. So the next thing you want to do is stop and consider pacing. Now, we already talked about pacing based on the kind of overall length of time you have to tell the story, but this is more of a screenwriting technique. But what you're going to want to do is think about your ups and your downs, how the story grows and flows throughout the outline that you've put down. If an adventure is nothing but challenge after challenge after challenge after challenge, where the players never really feel like they're getting ahead, they just feel like they're facing an ever-increasing wave of foes, that's actually not very fun. It's a one-beat story. It's a story that just flows through challenge. The opposite is also true. If you're telling a story where encounter after encounter after encounter is easy and the players get a whole bunch of rewards, that's too many. That's too easy. That's too many upbeats in a row. You need to measure those and do upbeats and downbeats. There are challenges that look like the party may not succeed, followed up by rewards and combats that are easy. It's that push-pull between challenge, reward, between positive outcomes versus more negative outcomes that keep people engaged in a story. So think about it this way. If I'm writing an adventure and the first thing that happens is the first combat's an easy steamroll. We have arrived. We're here to solve a problem, and let's say we're fighting against an undead, and there's some powerful undead lord lurking in this cemetery, and we have to go defeat him. And the first fight is just against skeletons, and we just wipe him out. That's an upbeat. We faced a challenge, and facing a challenge can be a downbeat. But this was an easy challenge, and we steamrolled it. That's an upbeat. The next thing, we go and we find a really powerful treasure. Well, that's another upbeat. But we're starting to creep into danger zone here. You don't want to keep having nothing but upbeats. Maybe the next thing that they should face is some sort of terrifying specter that they don't actually beat, but retreats when it gets badly wounded, and possibly goes down into the ground to warn others. That's definitely a downbeat. Now maybe after that we find the valuable treasure that might help us in our way. An old lantern that when lit causes the undead to maybe take damage or take penalties. That's an upbeat. So you want to have kind of a push and flow of upbeats and downbeats. That is going to keep your players interested. That's going to keep the story moving and feeling dynamic. And it's not going to feel kind of stale and straightforward. This is definitely a thing you want to apply on a larger campaign scale, but you can apply this to a one-shot adventure. As a matter of fact, you definitely should. You're also going to want to start analyzing your time and also how to spread out your fights. You don't necessarily want the game to be combat after combat after combat. It's a one-shot, and that might be fun, and maybe that's what your group is in for. Even then, I would still encourage giving everyone a pause, giving everyone moments to play their character and not have to worry about, is it my turn yet? Give them chances to explore the environment. And you're going to want to start looking at your outline, because right now, remember, it's just a diagram. It's a story diagram. You're not having to redraw the map. Some people like to start their adventures by drawing a map, and I've certainly done that too. But for a one-shot that you need to put together quickly, this is going to save you time. Save the map for the end. Start with just a story diagram that you can move the pieces around. Maybe, having my kobolds, the fight with them having traps and whatnot, maybe having that right after the toad fight isn't that good of an idea. Maybe they get inside first and find some sort of altar that the kobolds have set up that gives some sort of sense of why the kobolds are doing this. That makes perfect sense, and could be a thing that they keep right near their entrance, that they all, kiss the idol before they go out to battle. Might make sense. So yeah, you're going to want to look at places where you can add role-playing. This is a sin that many of us adventure writers fall to, is that we're writing a dungeon, and it's even a dungeon filled with just undead. You still have to find places to put in things that the players can role-play with. Some sort of sympathetic character that they can talk to. It could be a magic item, it could be a spell, it could be a ghost, it could be anything. But you're going to want to look for places that the players can role-play instead of just roll dice. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So you're also... Well, let's make sure I got everything on the outline of that part. Okay, there it is. Yeah. All right, so you're also at this point in time going to want to finish off your kind of pacing look through by balancing your risks and rewards. You're going to want to start thinking about, okay, what kind of rewards am I giving them for what sort of risk they're taking? Obviously, the end of the adventure should include some great reward, but you're going to want to include rewards during the adventure as well, because that reward at the end, remember, we're playing a one-shot, they may not be able to play with. It's like, oh, at the end of this you gain 10 million gold. Too bad you're never playing this character again. So, but that lantern they get in the middle that causes undead to burst into flames whenever it's lit, that's the thing they're going to use now. That's the thing they're going to be excited about throughout the campaign. The treasure you give them at the end is almost inconsequential. So once you've done all this, you should have a story diagram that's relatively stable. So the next thing you're going to want to do is start to create encounters. You're going to want to use the outline that you have to start realizing, okay, these are the actual encounters that I'm going to have. Organizing them usually by location. That's kind of the easiest way to do it. Now, you don't have a map yet, so that's a little tricky, but you can kind of at least imagine what the place looks like. Don't worry too much about the combat details or anything like that just yet. But you're going to want to start now solidifying your diagram into actual encounters. They could be role-playing encounters, they could be exploration encounters. I know that term doesn't actually work, but they can be combat encounters, right? You're just trying to now create the story in pieces that you can start mapping to locations. You're also going to want to start using these to mark where your rewards are going to be, where your combats are going to be in particular. Those should be related usually, but they don't have to be, right? Things that they find while exploring are just as fun. And once you're done with all of that, the next thing you're going to want to start doing is actually building the combats. This is usually the part that most GMs struggle with. I feel like in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we've made this a lot easier. But even then, you're going to want to, spend some time to make sure you're putting in nice, fun encounters that mix things up, that keep the players guessing, but also convey the theme you're trying to build. So I always, in a one-shot, like to start out with a fight that's relatively simple. I like to give the players a chance to steamroll something pretty early on. Doesn't have to be the first fight, could be the second fight. But I want to make sure that the players have a chance to kind of really flex at some point in time. And you want this to be early on, because you want to give them a sense of accomplishment very early on. That way that accomplishment can be threatened. It's the kind of the oldest trick in the book, but you do want to give the players opportunities where they can very easily succeed, very strongly kind of flex their characters' abilities and what their character is built for, without having a train wreck the entire story. So as that goes on, you want the challenges to ramp until you eventually get to the hardest challenge, which is probably the final fight. For one-shots, I really do not recommend doing, and then there's another fight on the way out that's kind of inconsequential, right? I mean, make the final fight the one that counts. This is also a very good time, thank you, chat, to note that this is also where you really want to think back to who your players are, what type of characters they're going to play, and try to build in moments where they can really show off what they're good at. So if you know one of them loves to play rogues, make sure to put in a spot where their trap finding skills or their sneaky skills are really going to pay off. If they are, if there's going to be a cleric in the group having some undead or some diseases or some religion knowledge that they can get, right? Things like that are a good thing to build into your stories for every type of campaign. For a one-shot, it's especially important to think about it because if you miss someone this one time, there isn't a next time to make it up to them. When you start planning out your fights, this is also when you're going to want to start thinking about where those fights are taking place and what is going to make those fights interesting. I abhor, even though sometimes you have to do it, fights where it's just a monster in a room and that's it, right? I mean, I think there are places for that in most stories. But I generally like to think about how can I make this fight more interesting by its environment, by the tactics, by the ways that the PCs might be allowed to approach it. So, let's talk about the mud toads in this kobold adventure. Well, the mud toads are interesting because the players are going to be on a nice firm path, but the mud toads live in the mud, so they don't care. So they're going to have like mud-based ranged attacks, and that's a lot of fun. And the PCs are going to have to find a way to fight them. That in and of itself is interesting enough. Like, I feel like even though there isn't much to that map or that location, it's an interesting challenge for the players to solve. Now, when I actually map it out, I can make it even more interesting by including maybe there are ways to get around the mud, but it requires you to move across planks that go over the mud to little hills. And so there are ways to get at the toads without having to go through the mud, but you still got to run around everywhere to get there. That could be fun. Thinking to the other big fight in here with the kobolds in the room where they're up to their waist in mud. Well, I've already got that, right? The kobolds are on stilts. That in and of itself makes that fight really interesting and fun to play with. But this is the point in time where you're going to want to start considering those things. And then finally, it's time to draw a map. Now, for a one-shot, this does not need to be a highly polished, finished map. As a matter of fact, the initial diagram of your story can serve as the basis of the map. I generally take a fresh piece of paper and just start drawing the rooms. At this point in time, they can just be bubbles, right? So, I might draw a bubble that's just outside with the toads. I don't know what it looks like just yet. I don't need to know. That leads to the antechamber with the shrine. That leads to 3 different areas, right? Because this is the point in time where you do want to start thinking about, hey, I don't want this to be a railroad. I want there to be more than one way to get through this place. Great. Well, maybe there's a passage that leads off to their larder and their barracks, where there might be more kobolds to fight. Maybe there's a different path that leads not to the larder and the barracks, but instead leads to the pen where they raise these toads. And maybe there's some mud toads that spit mud balls. You can go deal with that. And but both of those then have a passageway that leads to the end fight. Now, this is a one-night thing, so if they explore the whole thing, I'm pretty good. Maybe some of the paths connect in different ways, right? This is the point where you start diagramming out and just trying to figure out how everything fits and how everything works together. I'm dealing with a weird kind of mud village filled with kobolds, so I don't really have to worry about the fact that some of the trails cross over each other and don't connect. Some might be deeper underground than the others. It's fine. But this is the point where you also have to start doing actual mapping if your adventure is going to use minis and maps. Minis and like maths. This is the point where at least your combats, you're going to want to actually draw the map of. I am not going to respond to that comment about rib bits. Not doing it. Wait, I just did. Alright, so moving on. Cat Black, you monster. Alright, so that's what you want to do. That's kind of the last stage in planning. Is you know what your encounters are, you know what they're going to contain, you've balanced them out to make some easy, some medium, some moderate, and one hard encounter. You want to make sure that I generally try and make sure that these can all be accomplished within 1 day of adventuring. It just keeps the threat level high. It keeps everyone's tension high. That doesn't have to be the way you plan it. If you want, it could be a series of harder encounters where they only fight 1 per day while they're trying to escort a caravan through a mountain pass. That's fine too. All right, so let's go ahead and sum up step 2, planning. You want to build memorable scenes. That's where you want to start, with memorable scenes. You then want to take those scenes and create a story diagram. Start plotting them out. Start filling in the pieces that come between. You want to think about adding a twist. If you do, you want to adjust your diagram before you go forward. You want to consider your pacing. How much time do you have? How are things spaced together? Are you doing up notes and down notes in a good mix? Once you've got that all figured out, you want to actually start creating encounters. You want to start out with some easier stuff and end with the hardest stuff. You want to space out your treasure throughout. Don't just add it all to the end. You want to balance out the combats. Make sure that they're fun and engaging. They occur in interesting tactical locations, not just a monster in a room. And then you want to create whatever map that you need. Don't worry if the rest of it's mostly just a diagram. That's fine. Just have an understanding of what the space looks like and how the players interact with it. If you're going to get into fights, though, on maps, you want to draw those out in advance. And if you have the time and you have enough mats, you actually might as well go out and draw them on the battle mat in advance. Save yourself some time at the table. Your players will appreciate it. All right. Let's move on to the final step. Step 3. Finishing touches. So, once you've got kind of all of that, you're almost done. To be honest, at this point in time, you are close to being finished and ready to go. And if you have to, you can probably jump straight into it. But if you got a little bit more time, there's some things to do that are definitely worth it. The first thing I like to do is just kind of look through my outline and make sure it has a good flow. Think about how the players are going to interact with it. Think about if there's any spots where they're going to jump the rails and go somewhere else, or think of something different. There's only so much of this you can do, but it's worth doing the kind of initial sniff test just to make sure that you're not missing anything obvious. Next up, you're going to want to make sure your adventure has the following couple things. If it is long enough, if you have a big enough adventure, make sure you include ways for the PCs to rest that make sense, right? Nothing is kind of worse than having a kind of dungeon filled with undead that wander around and the PCs really can't rest there. And they're also 5 days from town. All of a sudden you've created a situation where the players are incentivized to just leave and come back in a few days or something. That can create some real story flow problems. So look for a way that they can rest. Maybe there's a crypt in there that they can lock the door and it's a stone vault. There's no way the zombies are going to beat their way in, so it allows the PCs to rest. That sort of thing. You're also going to want to look at the length of your story and identify parts of the encounter that you can trim or that you can add to. So if there are moments in the adventure that you think are very critical, you're going to want to note those. But if you're running the adventure and you're finding that it's going long and you don't have enough time to kind of get everything in, you're going to want to look for pieces you can trim out. The opposite is also true. Are there encounters or parts of your adventure that you can expand, that you can add to if things are going too quickly? Did the players breeze through the mud toads and now you need to make sure that the next fight at least takes up a bit more time, otherwise we'll be done too fast? You're going to want to identify those things in advance, or at least keep them in your head. This is a trick I use an awful lot when running the live games I've been running. Knights of Everflame and Oblivion Oath both utilize this particular tip a lot because I'm working under a time constraint, as are you. When you're running a one-shot, it's not infinite. You can't just say, well, we'll pick up the rest of this next week. There may not be a next week. So you may want to be able to just trim out a little bit or add a little bit. Make sure it fits. The next thing I like to do is work on the intro. If I am going to start out with a little bit of box text, I oftentimes like to write that in advance. Even if I'm running a one-shot, I will generally start off with a paragraph of box text, something that sounds good. That way I don't have to invent it on the fly. I'm really good at inventing stuff on the fly. But believe it or not, I really like having a bit of box text to start off my adventures. It just takes the load off of getting it right at the start, setting the scene the right way, and not forgetting any critical piece of information. Don't be afraid to write a bit of box text. I know it is generally maligned, but in reality, it's there to help you. And especially at the start of an adventure where if you forget a thing, you might set the whole adventure off on the wrong foot, it's generally worth working on. Yeah, I'm a DM that lets everyone use my homebrew stuff. That's kind of right. All right, next up, work on your outro. This is how it ends. I know we don't like to villain monologue. That's perfectly fine. But having a bit of text that describes what the final scene is going to look like, you're gonna appreciate that later. Not mandatory, but something I like to do if I have the time. Finally, you're going to want to, when it comes to your adventure itself, you're going to want to look at the very end and look to see if there's a spot where you can leave a bit of a trail. Add an intriguing mystery, put a little breadcrumb at the end. Do something that maybe suggests there might be further adventures to come. There doesn't ever have to be, but if you run a one-shot and everyone had a really good time, odds are you're going to be asked to run a one-shot again. Best to leave yourself an opening. I always like to throw a little bit of a twist at the end, and just add something in there that the players can pick up and come back to me next time and be like, hey, what was the deal with that? And be like, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out the next time we play. All right, we're kind of the wrap up here now at this point. What are the last things you do? Well, gather your materials before the game session, right? Making sure I'm okay. Oh, great. Yeah, gather up your materials, gather your minis, your maps, stats, books. If you're running Pathfinder, I can't recommend the monster, the bestiary battle cards highly enough. They are fantastic. They have made my life so immeasurably much better when it comes to running combats. All I have to do is grab the cards and throw them in my thing. I don't have to have another book. Yeah, there we are. Hey, look, an ad. No, I don't get any extra money for selling them. I just love them. I think there's something we should have done forever ago. But, you know, they exist for other games as well, and they're highly worth doing. And even if they don't exist, grabbing photocopies, printing from PDFs the pages of monsters you want is something I have done for decades. I have always done that ever since back to the old monster manual that came in a 3-ring binder. I would take out the pages of the monsters that I would be using and keep them. That way I didn't have to have the book open. It's a very old habit of mine. So, very fun. And then, last but not least, if you have any extra time at all, at the very end, do everything else first. I usually like to take any extra time I have and see if there are easy ways I can up the quality of the event. Make it feel not like a thing I whipped up in half an hour. Are there any handouts I can prepare? Are there any props I can grab? Can I get snacks for the table that are themed to the game? Anything to up that quality level that's easy and quick. Handouts aren't necessarily easy and quick, but, you know, if you've got a good piece of parchment background and a decent printer and a nice cursive-looking font, or if you're good at doing, you know, ink, you can make your handouts relatively easily. I've done this on a number of occasions, and it is always worth doing. Snacks are always a good idea, though. Yeah, that's the easy button. No, I'm just going to bring some snacks. Your players are never going to say no to snacks. Alright, so to recap. I saw a question asking, could I give an example or two of themed snacks? Let's say I'm running this kobold adventure, and I get some of those, any muddy looking chocolate snacks would be kind of a fun addition to that game. If I'm running something with creepy, spooky undead, right? You know, getting a bunch of kind of creepy undead recipes is actually relatively easy. For my Halloween game every year, I would do, not every year, but many years, I would do like, oh, here's a bunch of Halloween themed snacks like gummy worms and lady fingers, but they're actually shaped to look like fingers with like a almond sliver for a nail and dipped in red raspberry jam to look like severed fingers, things like that. Lots of fun, simple steps like that. All right, so let's go through the last step there again. You're going to want to check the flow of your outline, make sure that everything's flowing the way you want. You think about places where the players might deviate. You're going to look at ways for you to alter the pacing if you need to, giving the players a chance to rest, trimming on encounters, adding to encounters. You're going to want to make sure that you have those noted in your outline. You're going to want to work on the intro and the hook. Give yourself some box text to get things started, and make sure that the NPC that the players are going to interact with is fun and engaging and has answers to their most obvious questions. You're going to want to work on the outro and the main villain. If you want to give a bit of dialogue to the villain, you can. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of grandstanding monologuing. Just don't make it too long, because it starts to seem ridiculous, and the players are like, why can't I shoot him in the face already? Let him shoot him in the face already. But, you know, if he's got a word or two to say, that's fine. Leave a trail for the next game. It doesn't have to be anything huge. Could just be something sinister at the end. Could be a weird mystery that isn't resolved. Could be a strange thing they find that makes it seem like someone else is maybe responsible. Make sure that the game that you're writing, though, is satisfying. It has a satisfying end. Don't actually leave the villain out of the adventure. But feel free to lead a breadcrumb to something else, something new. Gather up your gear for the game. Minis, maps, stats, books, whatever you need. Get all the pieces together in advance. And then use any extra time you have left to add quality to the game. Work on handouts, props, snacks. Go buy some snacks. So, that's the lecture. Brief recap. You want to start with the basics. Figure out your who, your what, your why, your where. Then you want to move into the planning. Build your scenes. Turn that into a diagram of the story. Turn the story diagram into an outline of encounters. Balance out your encounters. Figure out where your combats are. Create the combat encounters. Do what the minimum amount of mapping you need. And then move into finishing touches. Look for ways to trim your story or expand it as needed. Flesh out the intro-outro a bit. And you're pretty much ready to go. Gather up your stuff. I mean, you can... The thing about this is, if you have less time, you can trim out some of these steps, and it still totally works, as long as you hit some of the key components. You will find that you will have an adventure ready to go in no time flat. So, that about concludes the main portion of my lecture. I'm going to open it up to some Q&A. Let's keep it about adventure design, though, folks. I know folks can ask me an awful lot of questions about an awful lot of stuff. So we're going to move on into the Q&A, and we'll do this for a little bit and see where it goes and see where it takes us. Questions? I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm very frequently asked to make one-shots, especially for conventions and stuff, so I got a lot of experience doing it. What level range is easiest to plan for? I think that depends an awful lot on the game you're running. If we're talking about Pathfinder, obviously low-level adventures are easier to write than higher-level adventures. But I actually think now with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that doesn't matter as much as it used to. There used to be a point in time where creating a higher-level encounter was a lot more of a chore. That's not the case anymore. Creating monsters is not really that much harder at high levels than it is at low levels. Creating NPCs uses the monster rules, so all of it goes a lot smoother. That said, I still think low-level encounters are still easier to design, so skewing low for a one-shot is never that big of a deal. Also, the thing you have to remember for a one-shot is the players aren't going to have a chance to get really accustomed to what their character is all about. So if you're running a one-shot and it's high level, they're really going to have an awful lot to take in a very short period of time. For a one-shot, I usually like to keep it at like 5th level or lower. Quarantine Pathfinder. Yeah, I mean, feel free to start the hashtag, right? Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, CR20 plus encounters were... I have known professionals in the industry who have taken multiple hours to build those high-level encounters. That is not really the case anymore with 2nd Edition. Yeah. And there is something to note, too, about whether or not you make the characters for the players, right? So if you're doing low-level, then that's something you definitely want to do. I generally like to let my players make their own characters, even when I'm running a show or something like that. Every one of the shows that I've done, Knights of Everflame, Oblivion Oath, the stuff I did with the Glass Cannon guys, they always made their own characters. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Questions. Who has a question? Would I say that sticking to the core book is easiest for one-shots in terms of character creation? Yeah, I think that's generally true. That said, I don't think it's mandatory. But what I do suggest is that GMs always contemplate limiting their sources. So if you're going to add, if you have brand new players, stick to the core. It's got more than enough for everyone to work with. If you're dealing with experienced players, maybe pick 1 or 2 other expansion books to add to your kind of mix for that adventure, and just call it good. There's no need to use bits and pieces from every single book that you have. And this from the guy who makes them. And trust me, I want you to have them. I just want them to be tools in your toolbox to use when the time is right. That doesn't mean you have to cram them into every single adventure that you use. I generally like to limit my tables to just 1 or 2 books, just to keep things moving and keep everybody kind of in the same range. How would you go about creating a level 0 adventure? Or would you just leave the background as something they have to uncover in game? Well, level 0 adventures, I think those are very doable. If you've picked up the Game Mastery Guide, you've certainly seen some of our rules and guidelines for creating 0 level characters and what type of adventures they can go on. It's not really that much different than creating a first level adventure, so... Andy is bad at games asked, have you ever played any of the one-sheet RPGs like Honey Heist? No, but I did write one a little while back called Junk Bots. I think you can find it on DriveThruRPG. I think it's probably pay what you want. I don't think anybody ever pays me anything for it. So if you want to go check that out, knock yourself out. It's an entire RPG on one page. If it was an undead heavy one-shot, would you tell the players? I think it depends on what type of story you want to tell. If you want to tell a story about a bunch of clerics and paladins and whatnot that are going into a graveyard to purge it of undead, that could be a real fun story to tell. You could also then dramatically up the challenge because they have an awful lot of tools to deal with them. That could be really fun and really interesting. If you don't want them to prepare for that, then don't tell them. I think that it comes down to what type of story you want to tell. Telling the players about what kind of adventure they're about to go on can have very positive results because it can be really an interesting, different kind of story experience than we're most used to when it comes to role-playing games. Most of the time it's, here's the adventure, and your characters have to figure out a way to slot into it. We don't oftentimes get to experience the, here is this larger adventure plot. You already know what it is on its face, so you can come prepared. It's like how rarely the players get to ambush the bad guys. It feels like a special treat when it happens. I've been asked, are there any suggestions for good sources of inspiration to spruce up classic adventure environments, dungeons, ruins, mountain passes, etc.? I don't know that there's necessarily sources of inspiration. So much of it is really just look at what makes it classic. So if it is a dungeon and you're like, wow, dungeons are really classic environments. What's a dungeon? Well, it's a series of rooms, underground, built, it could be a crypt, could be specifically built to keep something in or keep something out. Great. I now know my basics. So to spruce it up, change some facet of it, right? Maybe the thing is filled with a foot of water. That's real weird, right? Just in and of itself, because now the players can't see the floor, especially if it's brackish, muddy water. The entire dungeon is filled with a foot of water. Why? It flooded. Rained real heavily the past few weeks, and now the dungeon is flooded with a foot of water. That alone makes it a more interesting environment to play in. Irish BB suggested, go slay the dragon, everyone makes dragon slayers. Yeah, that could be really fun, especially if everyone's competing to kill the dragon, and they all think they're going to be the one to do it. That could be a fun one-shot. Would you create background options to help lead the players into what they can expect so that they can create synergy? You might. Backgrounds are one of the easiest things for a GM to make. We have given pretty obvious guidelines as to what a background can be. They're, one of 2 boosts. They're a skill feat. They're a skill training, and a lore. There's not a lot there that you can get tripped up by. So you can use backgrounds to create something that's tailor-made to the story you're trying to tell. I highly recommend doing it. That's why I included backgrounds in Fall of Plaguestone, was so that when you started playing, a lot of the characters had a direct line into the story, and then I actually went and built side quests based on what background you took. Do I have a fundamentally different design process for longer adventures? Asking specifically about the adventure I ran for GCP at PaizoCon last year. I do. It's not fundamentally different is wrong. No, it's very similar. But I would say that for those sorts of longer form narratives where I know I have multiple parts of the story, it adds additional steps. And what it does is it adds breaks in there that I want to make sure that I hit certain notes on the break. Right? So each one of those adventures, I knew where the end was. I just didn't know when or how exactly we were going to get there without trimming or adding pieces to it. Remember when I said that I like to be able to trim and expand an adventure? I call that accordion adventure design because I can take it and expand it or I can shrink it. And that allows me to make sure I get to the point where the story needs to be. For a one-shot, this is your whole goal, is to make sure that you hit the spot you want to hit. You don't want to have your one-shot not be fulfilling because you wrote too much and you were uncompromising in trimming pieces out. You actually want to look at things that you can intentionally chop and just be like, yep, that room doesn't even exist. Those two rooms are now connected. The room that was between them just vanished into the ether. The players will never know. Deacon Blues, you're talking about a good twist, which is they go to kill the dragon, but it's not a dragon at all. It's someone who's been changed into a dragon, or maybe the dragon is someone else's servant. Maybe the dragon is actually enslaved, and you can free it. Looking for ways for the players themselves to interact with the story in that way and actually change the narrative based on their decisions is a fun and worthwhile expenditure of your time. What do I suggest as good, fun items that usually serve as good mid-adventure rewards without being too powerful or MacGuffin-like? I don't know. For a one-shot, MacGuffins aren't necessarily outside the question. You don't really have to worry about ruining the campaign long-term. It's a one-shot. But, that said, giving treasure that is immediately useful is the key. That doesn't mean it has to be the perfect tool for the job. It just means that you want any treasure you put in the middle of the adventure, you want to think about what comes after it and go, how will they be able to use this? If it's a weapon, that's obvious. But if it's a lantern that reveals cryptic clues, you're going to want to write the cryptic clues for the rest of the dungeon. And maybe for the stuff before as well, because they're going to go back and check it out. I think that you're going to want to, think about how the players will actually use the item and make sure that they have ample opportunities to do so once they find it. Finding an item that they have no use for may be fun, but it doesn't really matter, right? A deck of many things. I mean, yeah, if you want the entire adventure to go off the rails, include a deck of many things. That's kind of the general rule of what that item does. It sends adventures off the rails. All right, we'll take a few more questions if anybody has any, and then we'll call it good here today. So, desk of many things, great. Yeah, bag of weasels. Every time you open a bag, there's a 50% chance you pull out a weasel. It's like a bag of holding, but instead sometimes you get weasels. Oh, yeah, you can totally base an entire one-shot off finding a deck of many things. I think I've even done that before. Especially if you then tailor the deck and take out a bunch of the cards. That can be cruel and fun. You take out the cards you don't want to see, and then it becomes they have to get through the deck for some reason. That can always be fun. Smokebeard, thank you for the sub. Yeah, I mean, basically. Isn't that Jumanji? Sure. Yeah, they're similar enough. All right. Desk of many things in print. You know, we nearly included... what else did we nearly include? Eye of Robes? Yeah, from that speech I gave last year. So, all right, folks. Well, if anybody's got a last minute question, we'll give you a moment to throw it out there right now. Otherwise, we're gonna wrap this up. What's my favorite villain to use in one-shots? Depends on my mood. I mean, I'm known for liking liches, but actually liches are terrible one-shot villains. Just because they're so hard to kill. You know, you can kill it, but you don't really kill it, so it's kind of not satisfying. I actually generally like to include villains that are a little bit more understandable and straightforward. So, like, yeah, I mean, I like to go with something that isn't generally just like one villain or like, you know, like a group of bad guys. That way they can beat up a bunch of them. It makes for a more satisfying experience. So I like to go with humanoids and things like that, or undead, or you know, I'm always drawn to undead. You know, that's how that works. How do I deal with people choosing classes that are a bit out there for one-shots? Well, I mean, I think that comes down to expectations. If you're, you know, if you're running a game where you need the characters to be a certain thing, then just tell them. But I mean, if they're being a weird character, that's fine. I mean, you know, that's the adventure you're about to have. I mean, it's not. I talk a lot about what you do as a GM to plan this big intricate story, but really you're just doing one part of the story. The other part is the players, is what they want out of the story and what they bring to the table through their character. And you as GM have to kind of respect that and play with it, because that's the story that you and they have come together to experience. So, I mean, how do you account for it? You just do, right? You just add to your story things that they will find interesting and engaging. Yeah, fair enough. All right. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. That's the thing I think you always have to remember. When you're writing an adventure, when you're writing a story for everyone to enjoy, for everyone to take part in, you have to remember that you are writing this for everyone to take part in. That's a bigger responsibility. That job is harder on the GM in a one-shot. You generally don't have time to sit down and talk about everyone's long-term expectations. You are the one that has to be maximally flexible to your players' desires while the game is ongoing. That's why it's good to keep things a little loose and to be able to add things or take things away. You want to be able to figure out what the players are actually wanting from this game and try and deliver that the best you can. Now, you can, of course, talk to them a little bit about it in advance, but it's a one-shot, so you're not going to have that opportunity half the time. Most of the one-shots I run are for strangers at shows. I don't even know who they are until I sit down at the table. That obviously does not give me any time at all to get to know them or figure out what they want out of the game, so I have to ad-lib. That's kind of the only way you can roll. And yeah, Deacon Blues does bring up a very good point. Sometimes the most memorable stories are the ones that went way off script, and I just rolled with the punches. Whatever the players gave me, that's what I took and ran with. I think you can have a deeply engaging time if you're willing to be flexible, if you're willing to find a way to make sure that everybody is having fun and not get so stuck up on your own grandiose plans. Trust me, everybody's going to have a better time at the table if you are willing to work with them. All right, everybody, I think that's about going to wrap it up here today. I want to thank you all for participating in this lecture. I've had a really good time here today, and I think this might be a thing we do more of in the future. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.